Welcome to Eye on the Issues. Today we are talking to pain medicine doctor Kenneth Finn out of Colorado Springs, Colorado. Dr. Finn, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Doc, we're talking today, of course, about marijuana and for the most part, and its impact across society, obviously, the younger generations. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the possibility of pregnant women using it and how that may play out. Let's begin by talking about what this is doing to the communities in respect to the opioid crisis.
All right. Well, I don't know if you know much about me or if you want a little background.
Sure.
The reason I went down this road and why I am sitting
Please.
here today. I've been a practicing pain medicine physician since 1994 in Colorado Springs. Board certified in physical medicine and rehabilitation, pain medicine, and pain management. I'm the current president of the American Board of Pain Medicine and have been on their exam council for over 20 years, writing test questions for medical providers that want to have a higher level of understanding and treating patients in pain. I edited a medical textbook called Cannabis and Medicine: An Evidence-Based Approach. I founded a nonprofit called ISAC, which is the International Academy on the Science and Impact of Cannabis, and I speak internationally on this issue and the public health impacts of cannabis, most recently to the United Nations in Vienna. So I know more than the average bear in this space.
No kidding. Yep. All right. So let's begin by talking about what you think. I guess if we can, it's been legalized. Obviously, marijuana has been legalized in the state of Colorado for, I guess, a decade, maybe a little over a decade, both medically and recreationally. What has it done to the state from a 10,000-foot standpoint? What has it done to the state of Colorado?
It's created another public health disaster in my mind. Just further clarification, we actually voted to legalize marijuana for medical purposes in 2000. So we've had medical marijuana when we implemented in 2001. So we've actually had medical marijuana program in Colorado for over 22 years now. It lied dormant for many years because there was no infrastructure, there was no registry for patients. The doctors were, stigmatized to recommend, so they were fearful. And then after a lot of politicking in 2009, we had, for lack of a better term, de facto legalization, when all the dispensaries opened across the state, to the point where they still outnumber the medical marijuana, or both the medical and recreational marijuana dispensaries outnumber the number of McDonald's and Starbucks combined in the state of Colorado. We have more pot shops than it's easier to get some marijuana than it is a latte or a Big Mac. And then we voted to legalize in 2012, and then we implemented in 2014. And I actually sat on the governor's task force for Amendment 64 in the Consumer Safety and Social Issues Work Group. And I've spent 4 years on our state's Medical Marijuana Scientific Advisory Council. And ever since then, things have really worsened in my mind. Just more recent data, Colorado is the worst in the country on auto thefts. We have a lot of crime. We have an increase in homelessness. I can't prove a causal relationship, but it certainly is a strong correlation when we open the doors for marijuana, really going back to 2009 and forward. So we really have had a very robust medical and recreational programs for at least 14 years now.
And so let's talk, if we can, about how you believe it's impacting the younger people there in the state of Colorado.
Well, in a variety of reasons. I mean, I think you have normalization of use. And so the younger people have a lower perception of harm. And when you lower the perception of harm, they are more likely to use marijuana. Just as disclosure, I am a former medical marijuana patient in the state of Colorado. Full disclosure, I don't use. But given as a pain physician, I was curious based on what my patients were telling me, that it's this end all be all supposedly of opioid substitute and it's going to help my pain. I got my marijuana card. I was a very active youth. I played collegiate soccer. I've had multiple knee surgeries. I need my knees replaced. And so I applied for my card, and it was a 15-minute, $250 visit. The doctor that interviewed me, because it was telehealth, it was during COVID, never asked about prior treatments that may have failed, any prior medications that I may have tried or failed. Maybe there's things I didn't try. never wanted records to review, never reviewed MRI reports of my knees. And even though it was a video visit, they never asked to see the scars on my knees, because I could be lying, right? And never asked for my scars, and actually never asked me my level of pain, which is the most common reason people get a medical marijuana card, is the pain. And on a day-to-day basis, given the fact I need my knees replaced, my pain is about a 0 to 2. It's not very bad. But within a matter of 60 seconds, I was approved for severe pain. And I got my renewal a year later with really no fanfare. It was kind of very simple. Oh, yeah, I still have pain. Okay, you're done. Bye. I tried to get my medical records from that doctor, and they don't exist. So this bona fide doctor-patient relationship, which is one of the foundations of a lot of states creating medical programs, is a complete ruse, at least in Colorado, and my understanding in other states as well.
And many people, of course, think pain management. They think marijuana. From a medical doctor and a pain management doctor standpoint, what's reality?
Well, reality is you don't have to be, you can make a recommendation for marijuana outside of your scope of practice. For example, a pain specialty provider doesn't have to be the person that makes a recommendation. I think that's how they kind of skirt the issue, because it's not a prescription. So it's not like I'm prescribing you a chemotherapeutic agent for cancer. I'm just recommending that you can use marijuana, and you get the green light from me, no pun intended, but you get the green light to use marijuana. Therefore, you can go to the dispensaries, and there's way too many loopholes in the state's program. There's a behavior called looping, where as a marijuana patient, I can go from dispensary A, B, C, and D and get my daily allotment or maximum amount that's allowed under law for my possession, without any tracking. There's no tracking of like the PDMP we have for opioids, for example, where we can monitor patients' behavior in terms of doctor shopping or pharmacy shopping. There's no such program in the state, in the marijuana world. So I can go to as many dispensaries as I can, again, knowing that they outnumber Starbucks and McDonald's, and get as much marijuana as I can fit in my car, and then become the local dealer. It's very easy to do. And that's a behavior called looping. And they try to close that about a year or so ago with a Senate Bill 1317 that I was personally involved with, to try to limit access to youth. Because the 18 to 21-year-old person is in that window where they're not old enough to get the recreational stuff, but they're old enough to have their medical card without parental consent. And so they can still be in high school, because there's a lot of 18-year-olds that are still in school. They can get their card easily based on my personal experience and what I know about the system, and then become the school drug dealer. And then they're selling to kids that are younger than them in middle school and even elementary school, or getting these products from upperclassmen.
And it's a different world in respect to what marijuana is these days versus 25 years ago. Explain how the potency is different and why that is such a big deal.
It's a huge deal, because the data is emerging that if the European data, for example, there's a 5-fold increased risk of first-time psychosis with what they call high-potency marijuana. And in Europe, because I have a lot of contacts there, they don't have anything really higher than 15% THC. That doesn't exist in Colorado. The average smoked flower is about 20% THC. Then you get into the world of concentrates, which is pushing 40 to 60% THC. And then you get into the world of dabs, waxes, and shatters that are pushing 80, 85, some claiming 100% THC. And these are available in the medical and recreational dispensaries. So, and there's no oversight, or there's contaminants. There's the products have things that shouldn't be in them, like cadmium or mercury or other heavy metals and arsenic. And those recalls that occur are few and far between, but they recall products that have already been consumed. I back in the day when I was growing up, the average THC content was about 2 to 4%. You can probably get your Maui Wowie or your Sensimilia that was maybe 8 to 10% THC. That was considered high potency at the time. Again, the potency is dangerous. I think we are in uncharted waters. We don't know what the long-term consequences are going to be on the developing brain, although the data is emerging on what happens over time on a chronic daily or near daily user. The data that came out recently showed a drop of IQ about 5.5 points over chronic time of use, and smaller areas of the brain that modulate memory. So we do know that the target organ is the brain in the world of marijuana. I mean, obviously alcohol, it's the liver, and tobacco, it's the lung, but the target organ in the marijuana world is the brain, and especially the vulnerable brain, which is still developing. And there's a lot of data on the impacts on the developing brain that are not positive. You know, there's really, although I know I sound like nihilistic, I know I may come across as a nihilist, but I'm not. I'm a physician, I'm a scientist. I believe there's components of the plant that might work. But dispensary marijuana has not been put to the test. There's too many components. There's too many variables. I mean, we already have Marinol, if you have not heard of that, or dronabinol, which is a synthetic THC. It's been around since the mid-'80s for chemotherapy-associated nausea and vomiting, and weight loss associated with HIV and AIDS. We have Nabilone, which has also been around, and we know the dosing on those products, which in dronabinol is about 2.5 milligrams, where the dispensary marijuana is 10 milligrams. So it's 4 times the amount of the medication we know about. And actually, have you heard of Epidiolex?
I have not.
Epidiolex is the only FDA-approved cannabidiol, or CBD. It's natural. It comes from hemp. They can mass produce and create a molecule called CBD, or cannabidiol. And the people from Alabama that actually studied it and researched it wrote my chapter in seizure. So I have an all-star cast in my book. But if you go to the Epidiolex website, because it's used for a very narrow spectrum of pediatric seizure, and if you look at the warnings and precautions, you are going to see liver damage, suicidal behavior, and sedation. And actually, the FDA has issued warnings and caution about people driving using CBD, because people don't understand that it may not be psychoactive like THC or tetrahydrocannabinol, but it's still not benign. I'm going to ask you a quick question. How many drug interactions do you think CBD has?
I don't know.
576. And a lot of these
Now, what does that mean exactly? So what does that mean by drug interactions?
So when you are taking medicine, and for example, if you're a diabetic,
it'll be impacted by something, right?
It can be the metabolism of a medication can be impacted by another medication. So if you are on multiple medications, like an anti-inflammatory, like ibuprofen, and you're on a blood thinner like warfarin or Coumadin, they don't want you using them together because they can interact and it can cause a serious health problem or complication. Cannabidiol has 576 known drug interactions that can cause harm.
So Doc, I got to ask you this, and this is our audience is primarily Wyoming. So I know you did a presentation in the University of, and I want to hear about that. But you know, on a national standpoint, there's still discussion about the legalization of marijuana. What goes through your mind when you hear these lawmakers thinking it's a good idea?
Well, what I think about is that the platform is that we need more research, and I'm all for research, and I'm all for study and proof. And give me a cannabinoid that works in pain that's met the muster of scientific rigor, and I'll bite off on that 100% of the time. The problem is that there's already been over 30,000 studies on marijuana, despite its classification as a Schedule 1. And they want to deschedule it because it'll open the door for more research, which is somewhat of a fallacy. It's a false narrative, because there have been tens of thousands of studies of this product and this molecule over decades. And I think the US government has already spent over $500 billion studying marijuana. It's already been well studied. And I think we need more study and research because the products have evolved and changed. You know, you've got potencies that are very all over the map. You have different delivery systems. I mean, they have marijuana tampons, they have marijuana rectal suppositories, they have marijuana eye drops, they've got nasal inhalers, asthma inhalers. So it's kind of this chaotic, it's a chaotic space right now because of the high variability of delivery. And there's no medication I'm aware of where the delivery is combustion. And I remind people we were in the middle of a vaping epidemic before COVID hit, where a lot of those people that were getting ill was either vitamin E acetate or THC. mostly from illicit markets, but some from regulated markets. So, and the vaping thing is still a problem. I mean, the people have had lung transplants because of what the damage they've done to their lungs. In Texas, there have been people that buy a CBD vape when it's not CBD and it's a synthetic cannabinoid, and they end up in the hospital. So I think it's kind of the Wild West. And the narratives to legalize because it's going to help our drug crisis is false. The fact that it's safe for use during pregnancy is false. I'll give you a couple of data points just in that arena alone, that if marijuana was truly a medication and had the same impact that what I'm going to tell you, it would be taken off the shelves and pulled off the market. So data point number one is that 70% of the marijuana dispensaries in Colorado tell women to use during pregnancy, during first trimester, right?
There's no law against that. There's no legal. I mean, that obvious. Well, go ahead.
No, there is no law against that, and that's a whole other discussion because the person behind the counter is called a bud tender. That's the industry term. That's the real thing, and the person behind the counter in Colorado and in other states, the only requirement to be a bud tender is you have to be 21 years of age. You need to have experience with marijuana, and you need a pulse. You don't need any medical training at all. So you have this person recommending 7% of 400 stores or dispensaries surveyed told women it's okay to use during first trimester without, and basically practicing without a license, right? The state won't do anything about that, which is a whole, they're failing along those lines. So that's data point number one. Data point number two is that there was a Canadian study following 12,000 kids that were exposed during pregnancy. It's called in utero exposures. And they followed what happens to those kids that were exposed over time. And they followed those 12,000 kids to middle childhood, so 9 to 11 years of age. And those children were having behavior problems, attention problems, social interaction problems. They were even having what they described as psychotic-like episodes. I did a literature search about, women use lots of things during pregnancy. So is there any evidence of psychotic-like experiences with women that use heroin or methamphetamine or cocaine? And I found nothing. And it seems very unique to cannabis exposure. The National Institute of Health had a follow-up piece, a paper in September 22, showing that those problems persist into early adolescence. So the in utero exposure data is somewhat concerning because the offspring are having problems. And actually, the most recent paper that came out, I think about 2 or 3 days ago, because I really keep my hand on the pulse, my finger on the pulse of what's going on. They followed these kids, and the number one variable, the number one risk factor for early onset adolescent use of marijuana was in utero exposure. So this data alone, if Tylenol did that and created psychotic-like experiences in the offspring of moms that were using, or were early onset drug abuse, Tylenol will be removed from the market. But nobody's paying attention to this public health crisis that's occurring right under the nose of everybody across the country and in plain sight of the law. So those are the concerning data points just from the in utero exposure data.
Let's talk about the mental health aspects of it and the connection with violence, and maybe talk about your slides.
Well, we know that the psychosis is a risk factor for adolescent use, or any use, actually. There's been stories about people that become acutely psychotic and then become involved in a violent act. One example here in Colorado, shortly after legalization, a woman by the name of Christine Kirk was on the phone with 911 because her husband, Richard Kirk, went to a dispensary and ate a bunch of edibles. He became acutely psychotic and ended up shooting his wife in the head while she was on the phone with 911 trying to get help. And there was only one thing in his system, it was THC. So there is a very clear link to misuse and violence. And, I always wonder with these mass shootings and acts of violence, like Uvalde, for example, the shooter was a known frequent marijuana user. I'm very curious to see what the toxicology is going to show, but since it's ongoing investigation, we are not able to obtain that toxicology report. But we do know that there are things that can precipitate a psychotic episode or a violent act. It's interesting. I've noted one of the common denominators seems to be knives, and I don't understand what that is or why that is. One of my people that I've connected to over time actually was a former bud tender in the state of Massachusetts, and she told me she carried 5 knives on her person and had to resist the urge to kill somebody when she was psychotic on high potency marijuana. And I'm more than happy to hook you up and you can hear her story, but her name is Ann Hassel and she's one of my heroes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. If let's say right now you're talking to the legislature in the state of Wyoming and they're considering legalizing marijuana in a 90-second elevator pitch, what do you say to them?
I tell them that they cannot claim ignorance, because in the states of California, Oregon, Washington, and Colorado, we had what we would describe as unintended consequences. We didn't realize that potency was going to go through the roof. We didn't realize there was going to be an increase in healthcare utilization. We didn't realize there was going to be an increase in marijuana-related driving fatalities. We didn't realize that the black market was going to flourish under the banner of legalization. And so we know those things have happened. And so any state that's entertaining this idea and going down this road cannot say, well, we didn't know that this was going to happen. They cannot claim ignorance, and this will be their legacy when things go sideways in that state. I've done a lot of work in South Dakota, Ohio, Alabama, and other states that are entertaining this, and I'm trying to help them put the guardrails and caps on to protect the communities and protect particularly the vulnerable, like youth, adolescents, and infants, for example. I mean, the number of pediatric exposures and children ending up in the hospital has increased by 1,300% over time. And that data is very consistent in Canada as well, who legalized across the country. I actually testified to the Canadian Senate on their marijuana bill, and they didn't listen to me, but now all their kids are getting sick with accidental ingestions and ending up in the hospital.
Wow, that's very disheartening to hear. So let me ask you this. In respect to Colorado, I mean, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. Is there any attempt underway to do anything to protect the people of that state?
Well, I think that the most recent attempt was the Senate Bill 1317, and they tried to put guardrails up to protect youth and restrict access of youth to do what I was talking about earlier on ease of access of obtaining a car, becoming the drug dealer, looping. They actually tried to put a potency cap, and that was a bargaining that was shot down. It was overrun and by the industry. They didn't want a potency cap because it would hurt business. And actually, there was a recent data, and I'm hoping you're going to go through this and listen again. But the most recent data, Colorado was inflating the THC of products so they can make more money in some of the industry. So, they inflate the potency. Lab directors in other states caught faking the lab data. The state of Oregon actually did an audit in 2019 where they were only able to inspect 3% of their stores, which is a big fail, and 1/3 of growers, which is a big fail. And the state of Oregon actually concluded that the products are not safe for human consumption, and they cannot guarantee the results of the testing. So we know that and again, lab directors are caught faking data. The head of the Michigan Marijuana Board was caught taking bribes, pay to play. I mean, the level of corruption and the amount of money in this space is huge. So people are going to be very tempted to do the wrong thing on the backs of the public. And when you have, I've met more parents that have lost a child to psychosis, suicide, homicide, homelessness, drug overdose. It all began with marijuana. Just a little data point: marijuana is now the most common substance found in completed teen suicide in Colorado. That never used to be the case. It used to be alcohol. But around 2012, that trend flipped, and marijuana is now present in about 30% of adolescents that kill themselves in the state. Number 2 is alcohol, but it's only 17%. So it's half the amount in toxicology reports is alcohol, compared to nearly 1/3 of the kids that complete suicide in Colorado have marijuana in their system. I mean, we're in the middle of a mental health crisis nationally, right? And it's complicated, it's multifactorial, but the one piece of the puzzle nobody talks about is marijuana, because of the negative mental health effects it can have on the developing brain. And it's it's probably a bi-directional relationship. Are they using because they're depressed, or are they depressed because they're using? Who knows if there's a right answer? It's probably a little bit of both. But kids shouldn't be having or have access to marijuana. But we have, Colorado has one of the highest suicide rates in the country. And it's that's what I find fascinating and somewhat concerning about marijuana, because it always seems to be at the dance, right? But nobody's paying attention to that person at the dance that nobody wants to talk about, the ugly girl corner, right? Yeah, but it's there. These driving fatalities, these mass shootings, these acts of violence, stabbings. It just not there all the time. And not everybody that uses is going to become a homicidal maniac. Not everybody that drinks a beer at a bar is going to get in a car wreck. Not everybody that smokes a cigarette is going to get lung cancer. But we know in these addiction for profit industries that make a lot of money for their respective industries, we know what the societal costs are, and nobody is talking about the costs. And that's kind of one of my platforms. I had a meeting with city council here recently, and they had a finance expert from the Air Force Academy and a finance master's student from Colorado College, right? And they said, well, you have this population, because we're the second largest city in the state. We don't have recreational marijuana here, right? We only have medical. And they say, if you make it recreational in Colorado Springs, you're gonna make this amount of money. Right. So then Mayor Suthers called me up and said, I want you to go next. I said, that's fine. And so I stood in front of city council and I said, I really find it fascinating that you two finance experts, and neither one of them can spell P&L. They can't, they talk about the profit. They don't talk about the loss. You having been here for a couple of years, I published a paper that Penrose Hospital lost $20 million between 2009 and 2014, just on the cusp of legalization, just from marijuana-related ER visits. If you take that hypothetical number across the state, that's a $500 million price tag. So we know what the cost of a driving fatality is. We know that the healthcare utilization is going up. We can't put a price tag on addiction treatment, but it's not a money maker for the state when you put all those things into the equation. There was a paper that said for every dollar generated, it costs $4.50 to regulate in Colorado. I'm not sure I believe that 450 number. I think it might be a little inflated, but I don't think it's profitable for the state when you add the societal costs in. And that's what people tend to disregard and ignore, is that there's a cost to this. And I've more families that were turned upside down and inside out all over a plant.
All right, I don't want to get into this too much, but can you comment briefly about Delta 8, some of these other options?
Say that one more time, you cut out.
Delta, could you comment briefly on Delta 8? I don't want to get too into it, but can you just kind of, how does this compare?
Well, Delta 8 is a isomer of THC, or Delta 9 that we know. And this is a loophole from the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill has created a massive loophole where you can create these analogs and what are called isomers of THC from hemp. So what they do, kind of short and sweet, they take a massive amount of plant material and they create a massive amount of CBD, or cannabidiol. Cannabidiol, through a chemical reaction, they can manipulate the molecule to create Delta 8, which has the same molecular structure as CBD and Delta 9, but they describe it as weed light. It's not as potent as Delta 9, but now, especially in the state of Texas and Florida and New Jersey and other states that allow these isomers from the Farm Bill, they're causing problems. There was a child in Virginia that died from a Delta 8 gummy, and his mom's being charged with murder right now. And I think she just got sentenced in Virginia for her allowing her child to have access to this Delta 8 product, and the kid died. So don't say nobody ever died from marijuana. That's a complete false fallacy. Nobody stopped breathing from marijuana generally, but kids don't metabolize these cannabinoids like you and I do. The data in the pediatric exposure world show that over 20% of those kids end up in the intensive care unit, and 4% of those kids do end up on a ventilator. The kids do have trouble breathing. So and the question is, how many have died, or how many have run into problems and never made it to the hospital? And the parents will, let's let Johnny ride it out.
Sure.
Right? We don't know those numbers because the poison control calls are going up across the country and in Canada. And it's interesting, in Canada, the province of Quebec has a lower increase or flatter curve on pediatric ingestions. And part of the reason, Quebec is the only province that has a potency cap.
Right. Jeez. Well, Doc, I've got to cut it right here, but I got to tell you, the information you shared is incredible. It's what people need to hear. It's eye-opening, and the country and the states really need to get their act together and understand what's really happening with the legalization of marijuana and the fallout. I would think you agree with that.
Oh, totally. And before we go, I just want to share you a couple of things with these slides, if you have a minute.
Sure.
I want to show you here's the Colorado overdose death data. And recall that the platform to legalize is going to help our drug crisis, right? We're in the middle of an opioid epidemic. And so here in Colorado, I live in El Paso County, you know what the map.
Yeah.
And this goes back to 2002. And the platform to legalize is going to help our problem. We have less drug overdoses. And over 80% of the medical marijuana recommendations and cards are for pain, me included. But this is what happened. The darker the color, the worse the drug problem with that platform and that knowledge. 02, 05, 08, 11, 14. It has not improved our drug problem. Here, I'm going to show you, this is the Colorado data. Going back to 2000, we voted on Amendment 20 and implemented in 01, and it was dormant for a while. And then we had de facto legalization in 09 that I talked about, and voted to legalize in 12 and implemented in 14. And you can see our drug deaths have gotten worse. There's our 20 data. It looked like the COVID curve. I mean, fentanyl kind of spun off into its own little world. And then there's the 21 data, and I actually have the 22 data. There's a little bit of a drop, which is probably good, but that doesn't equate a trend. I think the 23, 24, 25 data will show, is it really getting better? And I'm hopeful it is. But the other data point I want to talk about is, oh yeah, here we go. Americans spend more on weed than chocolate and craft beer. I mean, it really is a thing. I actually, in Washington, D.C., you don't need a doctor's supervision to be a patient. I don't call that a patient. And that they started that. You can go to a kiosk and say, I need my medical marijuana. I have pain, and you hit a button, and then your authorization from a kiosk, and look at the number of marijuana patients in DC. I actually published a paper last year that, because fentanyl is a problem, and now we have Trank coming down the pipeline, but the fentanyl deaths are higher in marijuana states than non-marijuana states. I mean, pretty significant. You can see on this one. And I mean, it's just, people don't understand or see this information. Here's a picture of a police investigation in Freeman County that had nothing to do with marijuana, but the police investigation led them to a storage facility, this Polaroid in there with a nutrient bottle at the side and a fully locked and loaded marijuana pipe at the baby's face. But I'm just trying to see if there's any other. The older people, we have more people from, that's pediatric data, people over the age of 65 in California. There was a 1,800% increase of those older people going to the hospital in the past several years. And again, when you have a patient population that may have problems with memory, cognition, and balance, and then you're going to give them a substance that may impair memory, cognition, and balance. And people that are older typically are on more medications. And let's talk about the 576 drug interactions with CBD alone, let alone THC. So there's this whole, I don't know what you call it, this web of problem. And again, I know I'm like a nihilist, but put the dispensary marijuana to the test and give me a product that's been proven to be effective. And we know dosing, we know the risks and proof. And I'm fine with that. But dispensary, cannabis has not been shown to be an effective analgesic or an opioid substitute. Our opioid drug problem is getting worse despite more states going down this road. So, and the platform is going to help our drug problem, but it hasn't. So if somebody can explain that to me, I'd love to hear that. Here's some of the products that are in the ER. Here's a 12 and 14-year-old split this product with 500 milligrams of THC on it, and they end up with a problem. Let's trying to see here if there's anything other that's really pertinent. This was a very good, one of our advisors from Denmark, I can't pronounce his last name, but he published a paper. This is circling back to the psychosis discussion we had earlier. That it was a 50-year study with 6 million people. And they concluded that up to 30% of schizophrenic cases would have been prevented if they averted regular cannabis use.
Wow, that's huge.
It's huge. It's a bombshell, I think. But,
yeah.
But
It is.
Nobody taps into this. Nobody has connected the dots. And so I don't know. It's just very frustrating.
We're going to continue this discussion at a different time because there's going to be a follow-up because you have so much knowledge. I could talk to you for hours. Thank you so much for your time.
All right. Excellent.